In the spring of 1984, something happened to Freddie Mercury in Munich that Queen spent the next 4 decades refusing to discuss in full. Not in interviews, not in the authorized biography, not in the documentaries that trace Queen's story across their career with varying degrees of candor. The event was absorbed into the official record under a heading that was technically accurate, but fundamentally incomplete: exhaustion, overwork, the understandable consequence of a demanding schedule. And for 40 years, that version held. It held because the people who knew the real version were either loyal enough or self-interested enough or simply private enough to let it stand. It held because Freddie Mercury himself, once he had recovered, made it clear that it was the version he preferred. And it held because the music industry of the early 1980s was extraordinarily good at managing the distance between what actually happened to its most valuable assets and what the public was permitted to know about those things. What happened in Munich in 1984 was not a minor incident smoothed over for convenience. It was a signal, loud, physical, and completely unambiguous, that the life Freddie Mercury was living was running at a deficit that would eventually become impossible to ignore. The question this story asks is not simply what happened. The question is why everyone who knew agreed, without needing to discuss it explicitly, to look away. Munich had been part of Freddie Mercury's life since the late 1970s, but by the early 1980s it had become something more than a city he visited. It had become the place where he could be himself in a way that London, for all its freedoms, could not accommodate. London was the city of the press and the industry and the social world that came with being the front man of one of the biggest rock bands in the world. London was where being Freddie Mercury was a constant and inescapable fact of existence, where walking into a restaurant or a bar or a theater meant being Freddie Mercury in that space, with everything that implied about attention and performance and the management of other people's expectations. Munich was different. Munich had a specific district, Schwabing, in the north of the city that operated by different rules, at different hours, for a population of people who were either genuinely unimpressed by celebrity or actively committed to a culture of discretion that made celebrity beside the point. Freddie Mercury had found his way into that world in the late 1970s and had never entirely left it. By 1984, he had an apartment in Schwabing. He had people he considered friends, not industry people, not people who needed something from him, but people who knew him as a person and who related to him on that basis. He had bars he went to where the staff knew his name and his order and were not interested in anything else about him. Munich gave him something that his public life had made structurally impossible: the experience of being ordinary. What Freddie Mercury did with that ordinariness was not, by any conventional measure, restrained. The Munich years were years of significant and sustained excess. He has said so himself in interviews from the later part of his life, when he spoke with more candor about certain things than he had been willing to earlier. The parties in Munich were long and elaborate and expensive. The drinking was serious. The drugs were not incidental, they were part of the social texture of the world he was inhabiting. And Freddie inhabited that texture with the same completeness and commitment he brought to everything else he did. This was not unusual for successful rock musicians of the early 1980s. The era had a specific relationship to excess. It was normalized, celebrated, treated as evidence of vitality and creative energy, rather than as a warning sign about anything. But for Freddie, the Munich excess was also something more personal than the era's general permissiveness. It was the freedom, finally and completely exercised, to live entirely as himself, to make no concession to the image, to push everything to its limit, because in Munich, unlike anywhere else, the limit was the only authority, and there was no one present with both the standing and the willingness to question where the limit actually was. The cumulative effect of this way of living had been becoming visible to the people who were paying close attention for some time before the spring of 1984. Not in ways that were catastrophic or that interrupted the professional work. Freddie Mercury's capacity for work remained extraordinary throughout this period, and the recordings Queen made during these years were among the most powerful of their career. But there were signs. He was sleeping less consistently. He was eating with less regularity. He was drinking at levels that had begun to shift from the celebratory to the compensatory. He was surrounding himself, in Munich, with people whose primary qualification for his company was their willingness to facilitate what he wanted, rather than their interest in whether what he wanted was serving him well. The people who truly knew him, who had known him long enough and well enough to have an opinion that he might have listened to, were mostly not in Munich. They were in London or on the road with Queen, or living their own lives at a distance from the specific gravitational pull of Freddie Mercury's Munich world. And the people who were in Munich were not, in most cases, equipped or inclined to intervene. The night of the collapse in the spring of 1984 was not an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of a trajectory that had been building for months, possibly for years, and that had been sustained by a combination of physical resilience, professional momentum, and the simple human capacity to not examine too closely the things that are proceeding in the wrong direction. What happened that night, the specific details of which have emerged in fragments from peripheral accounts over the decades, involved Freddie Mercury losing consciousness at a private gathering in his Munich social world. He was found by the people who were with him, people who were not band members and not management, and not anyone with a professional relationship to Queen or to the music industry. They were private individuals whose first and overriding instinct was to manage the situation quietly, without calling the kind of attention to it that a hospital or a formal medical intervention would have required. He was incapacitated for a significant period, and when he began to recover, the first decisions that were made were about how to describe what had happened to the people who would need to be told, and crucially, how to describe it in a way that contained the narrative within boundaries that everyone involved could live with. Brian May was not in Munich that night. Neither were Roger Taylor or John Deacon. The band was not together in the way that might have made immediate communication between members natural and unfiltered. What reached Brian May, and through him, eventually, the rest of Queen, arrived through channels that had already been through at least one layer of interpretation. Someone had spoken to someone who had spoken to someone, and at each stage of that transmission, the story had been adjusted, not falsified exactly, but shaped, emphasized in certain directions, de-emphasized in others. By the time it reached Brian May, the version of events that he received was one that placed the Munich incident within the framework of a working musician who had pushed himself too hard for too long and whose body had responded by demanding rest, which was, in the most literal and surface-level reading of what had occurred, not entirely inaccurate. It simply left out the specific conditions that had produced the exhaustion, the specific nature of the collapse, and the specific questions that a fully accurate account would have required everyone, including Freddie Mercury, to sit with and answer. Queen's public response to the Munich incident was exactly what the managed version of events required it to be. There were brief statements about overwork and the need for rest. The tour schedule was adjusted in minor ways. Freddie Mercury was described as recovering, which he was. The press, operating in an era before the kind of investigative scrutiny that became standard later, accepted the offered narrative without significant challenge. The music industry accepted it. The fan base accepted it. And within a relatively short period, the incident had been fully absorbed into the official record as a footnote, the kind of thing that happened to rock musicians who worked too hard, that was worth noting but not examining, that had been dealt with and moved past. The speed with which this absorption happened was not accidental. It was the result of people doing their jobs efficiently and of a cultural context that was not particularly interested in asking the questions that a more accurate account would have raised. The reason Queen hid it, and it is worth being precise about this, because the word hidden implies a calculation that was not entirely what was operating, is more complicated than cynicism and more human than self-interest. Freddie Mercury was a person who had made a fundamental and irreversible decision about what belonged to his public life and what belonged to his private one. That decision was not always comfortable and not always easy to maintain, but it was his decision, made with his full agency, and the people around him who understood and respected him, understood and respected it. The Munich incident, described accurately and in full, would have opened doors into the private life that Freddie Mercury had specifically and deliberately kept closed. It would have raised questions about the nature of the life he was living in Munich, questions that, in 1984, he was not prepared to have raised publicly, and that the cultural climate of the time made genuinely dangerous in ways that are easier to understand in retrospect than they were to navigate in the moment. Queen protected his privacy because they believed it was the right thing to do and because he had implicitly or explicitly asked them to. And because the alternative, letting the full story become public, would have had consequences for Freddie Mercury that none of them were willing to be responsible for producing. What makes the Munich blackout significant in the larger story of Freddie Mercury's life is not what it was in itself. It is what it was pointing toward. 3 years after that night in Munich in 1987, in a private meeting with the band at Mountain Studios in Montreux, Freddie Mercury told his bandmates that he had received an AIDS diagnosis. The lifestyle that had produced the Munich collapse was the same lifestyle that had exposed him to the virus that would end his life. This is not a causal chain that should be drawn too simply or too moralistically. The connection between how Freddie Mercury lived and what happened to him is not a story about punishment or consequence in any straightforward sense. But it is impossible to look back at Munich in 1984 and not understand that the body was, in the clearest language available to it, communicating something that the mind was not yet ready to hear. And the people around Freddie made the choice for reasons that were partly generous and partly complicated and partly the product of a cultural moment that simply did not have the vocabulary for the conversation that needed to happen to help him not hear it. The 40 years of silence that followed the Munich incident have not been total. Things have emerged over the decades in memoirs, in interviews given with varying degrees of candor by people who were in Freddie Mercury's orbit during that period, in the gradual accumulation of peripheral accounts that, taken together, begin to resemble something closer to a full picture than the official version has ever offered. What emerges from those fragments is not a story of deliberate deception or cold-blooded reputation management. It is a story of people who love someone and made the choices that people who love someone make when they are trying to protect that person from something they cannot fully see coming. The Munich collapse was a warning. It was not received as a warning because the framework for receiving it did not exist. And then 1987 arrived and made the framework irrelevant because the thing that Munich had been warning about had arrived regardless of whether anyone had been willing to look directly at it. Freddie Mercury got back up after Munich. He went back to work. He went back on tour. He made more music with Queen, some of the best music of their career. And he continued to live, in Munich and elsewhere, in the way he had decided to live, because the alternative was to stop being himself in ways that he was not willing to stop. This was not a failure of judgment or a refusal of wisdom. It was the decision of a person who understood, with complete clarity, that the freedom to be entirely oneself is worth the cost that comes with it, and who was willing to pay that cost rather than purchase safety through a smaller version of his own existence. What he could not have known in 1984, and what Munich was attempting to tell him in the only language a body has available to it, was what the specific cost would turn out to be. He discovered that in 1987, in a room in Montreux, in a meeting with the three people who had stood beside him through everything. And from that moment forward, the man who had collapsed in Munich in the spring of 1984 and gotten back up and continued as though nothing had happened, became instead the man who spent the last 4 years of his life making the most extraordinary music of his career in the full knowledge of what was coming. That is who he was. That is what Munich was part of. And that is why it was hidden, because the people who loved him understood, even if they could not fully articulate it, that the story of what happened in that Munich apartment was not theirs to tell. It was his. And he chose, with characteristic completeness, to tell it in the only language he ever fully trusted. He told it in the music.